Well, welcome everyone to our panel about responsible political engagement. My name is Maria Latini, and I'm the CEO of the U.S. Sustainable Investment Forum. For those of you who are unaware of the U.S. SIF, we're much like the Responsible Investment Association here in Canada. We're a local capital markets association, membership association for all actors. So we focus on the U.S., but obviously are very interested in what's going on with the rest of the world, and we collaborate with other sustainable investment forums or responsible investment associations around the world. So I am delighted to be here today with my esteemed panelists. We have actually over an hour to discuss this topic about corporate lobbying and how it's a key driver in advancing responsible investment activities. As many of you probably do know, or maybe if you don't, the PRI and OECD and other organizations have been working on lobbying and corporate lobbying through its partners for quite some time now. There have been a lot of benchmarks, quite a bit of guidance, best practice guides that have been produced by some of our peers here in the room. They've been focused on investors, focused on companies, and really what we're here today to do is kind of unpack what we're discussing. What does corporate lobbying mean? What does advocacy mean? How can we engage, I guess, more fruitfully to have dialogues that drive policy forward that are in the best interests of investors and in the best interests of corporates? So as I mentioned, we have an expert panel. To my right, we have Nancy Bélanger,
almost
Commissioner Commissioner of Lobbying for Canada. We have Caroline Boin-Margerit. No, tell me.
Boin-Margerit.
Margerit, Advocacy Director from Danone. And Lydia Kuykendal, Director of Shareholder
Nope, also wrong. Man, you just
you got the wrong.
That's okay. It's okay.
All right, say it.
Kuykendal.
I did ask them how to pronounce her name before, so I butchered that. So started off with the wrong foot forward, but Mercy Investment Services. So thank you all for being here to discuss this topic today. One of the things I wanted to start off with, especially when I came in as moderator to this topic, is a little bit of understanding of the context of the topic itself. So maybe I'd like to just kind of go through, what our definitions are of responsible political engagement. Maybe there's some distinctions between each one of our speakers, given maybe where you're sitting in the world or how you act within this space, and especially from the perspective of wanting to drive positive outcomes. So maybe Caroline, perhaps as a corporate, and since we're honing in on that particular actor in the sector, maybe let's start with you. I mean, how do you think about your role, given you're sort of the target of this conversation, not only within your firm, but sort of how do you define it as you start thinking about actors across the sector?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll give you the corporate view. I think for us, responsible political economy starts with the fundamental belief that the private sector has a legitimate and pertinent role to play in democratic, open, transparent decision making. The reality is that businesses don't exist in a vacuum. We are present in communities, ecosystems, environment. We impact them, and we're also impacted by what's happening around us. We've heard a lot about climate change, but there's also a huge number of other topics on sustainability. And so, there's a number of challenges that we face that just like every other stakeholder and actor, and it seems to make good sense to leverage the expertise, the scale, the resources of the private sector in helping find solutions to those. And I think especially when we have, systemic issues like climate change, where we know that public-private cooperation is fundamental. The big nuance in what you said is the responsible part. And I think it's fundamental for the private sector, and I think increasingly there's a realization of that, to act responsibly and open with integrity, transparency, and just like other actors as well. And it's not just a reputational point of view. And I think we've seen enough scandals in terms of private sector, but it's not just that. It's just fundamental. It's human relations. You have to be seen as a trusted partner. Otherwise, people are not going to want to work with you, and you're going to suffer the consequences of that.
Thank you. So Nancy, maybe you have a bit of a high level view. How would you describe your role? You're the public side. How is your intersection on this, and how has it evolved over time?
So as a regular of lobbying at the federal level, I have a bit of a different perspective, but it aligns very, very well. The first thing I said to my colleagues when we met on this panel was responsible political engagement. Every time I hear the word political, I think partisan. And it's intuitive for me in Canada to think partisan. And I know that's not what we mean. So sometimes just the language that we use. For me, responsible engagement, and I agree with Caroline, is that it is absolutely paramount that the private sector engage with the public sector. I mean, it's a necessity. The issue is how you do it to support a healthy democracy and public trust. And the way to do it for me is really two components, and the OECD has written about this, and I encourage all of you to go read what they've written, but it's really about transparency and meaningful transparency. It's the first thing. And then having an ethical or integrity framework. They have to go hand in hand. People talk about transparency all the time, but as far as I'm concerned, you need the flip side as well. You need ethical conduct and rules in place that will enhance the standards of ethical conduct. And to me, every participant has a role to play. So it's not just on corporations, but it's on the public sector. So you've got rules for our public decision makers, you've got rules about elections, you've got rules about access to information, privacy, lobbyists, anyone who engages in government relations. Everyone has a role to play to ensure that we create frameworks. I always talk about an integrated vision. Everybody needs to have that vision and work in the same way to encourage the best policy decision for our citizens at the end of the day. Public trust and good public interest in our decisions. I could talk about this all day, so I'll stop now.
That's your job. That's good. And again, I mean, from my perspective, or coming from the U.S., the term lobbying kind of has negative connotations. So I think it's useful to kind of unpack how we're thinking about this. And, Lydia, you come at the intersection of these two as an investor. I mean, how do these terms sort of sit with you? And I mean, given how the engagement on lobbying has kind of increased and evolved over the years, what has your focus been? How has it evolved, and why? And then we can talk a little bit more about the how.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So it's funny. We don't like the word political. We don't like the word lobbying. I don't like the word responsible. We don't really like any of the words that this panel is going to talk about.
What about meaningful?
I really like it. No, that's great. But I think it's important to discuss because responsible and ethical, I think, are fine to use in this context, but they're also very squishy, very fungible words. And what it means to an investor or a company or a state actor can be very different things. So for us, when we talk to companies about any kind of political expenditure, whether it's lobbying, advocacy, or any of the other sort of umbrellas that can fall under, I always revert back to what a very smart man, John Keenan, says, and he says what gets disclosed gets managed. So that's always the first step for us because, again, you can say you have responsible lobbying policies, responsible political giving structures, but putting that on your website doesn't tell us whether or not it's actually true. So how are you not only governing these policies that you have put out there, so what's the governance structure around them, but also what are the guardrails you have around them, and how transparent are you about all that? How do you know it's working? Like we know you have a policy, but how do you know the policy is actually being implemented and having the sorts of outcomes that you actually want them to have, as opposed to the exact opposite or no outcome whatsoever? I mean, these are important strategies, as have already been mentioned, for corporates for what are pretty obvious reasons. They're actors in the world, and so they should have a say in the political discourse around it. But we want to make sure that the political discourse isn't being overrun by a single actor or a single voice. So how do we know that the things you think you're doing are what you're actually doing it feels like a really basic question, but it's actually something that we end up talking to companies about quite a lot.
Right, and the unintended consequences potentially. So, I mean, one way to do that is to have regulations or some definitions around sort of some basic, fundamentals in the sector. So it would seem logical that if responsible practices could be defined, then it should be so easy to enforce it. But I don't think it's that easy, right? So Nancy, talk a little bit about how regulation can maybe incentivize better outcomes, and how it's maybe worked from your point of view, and maybe some of the challenges around sort of good codes of conduct and how that gets implemented into actual and codified, I guess.
Yeah, and a little bit to pick up on what Lydia said, it is important to have safeguards and regulations and rules in place to ensure, as you say, that it's not the most financial powerful groups that end up being the decision makers, and to make sure that we don't have information out there that is deceitful and that the data that our decision makers are using are wrong. How do we do that? Well, we do have to have safeguards and in place, and you need to have a regulator, which is my role in the Lobbying Act at the federal level, not disclosing what you're supposed to be disclosed, which is the same for most of the US and some of the European countries. It's an offense. It's a criminal offense under the Lobbying Act. So I investigate, and if you fail to provide information that you were supposed to, and then we can talk, I think our next question is a little bit more about what is meaningful transparency, what meaningful information you should provide. But if you don't provide it, it's an offense, and it goes off to, in Canada, goes to the RCMP. I've been in office now almost 7 years, and I've sent don't quote me, close to 50. Don't quote me, close to 15.
Exactly.
There's
50.
been the laying of 2 charges, 2 individuals, it's all in the public domain. And so to me, how do we make corporations and the private sector accountable? There has to be consequences, for sure. But I do believe that there needs to be a spectrum of sanctions. You can go from forced education, you can go from prohibited from lobbying for a certain while, you can have monetary penalties, and there are many jurisdictions that have monetary penalties, and then you've got prison, which is something that the US does a lot, but not in Canada for those who lobby while not registered. So that's on the flip side for transparency. Then you've got the ethical side of things. And at the federal level for lobbyists, for those who communicate with our federal decision makers, we have a code of conduct. The code of conduct that was in place until 2023 was very much principle-based. It was very much ensure that you don't give gifts that people can't accept. Don't be deceitful. Don't be, be honest. I have rewritten those rules to be a lot more prescriptive since 2023. Now it's a $40 limit. You can't give anything above $40. In Canada, corporations used to be able to sponsor travel. Lobbyists they can't do that anymore because it's definitely more than $40 to travel. Hospitality, $40. And that, to me, helps to level the playing field, which is another reason to make, to ensure. So you need strict standards. Now, if somebody breaches the code of conduct, it's just reputational. I issue a report to Parliament. Maybe they don't get clients for a few days. I don't know what happens, really. But it's very much reputational. But again, I believe there should be sanctions. So the regime is not perfect in Canada, and I keep asking us to amend and renew. But I think we do need standards that are clear and that are not principle-based, about trustworthiness, about disclosure and honesty in disclosure, and taking reasonable steps that the information you're providing to decision makers are truthful and not deceitful. Gifts and hospitality. And then I have rules about sense of obligation. Instead of talking of conflict of interest, which very often is defined in financial, I don't have a conflict of interest. I have no investment or no private interest. I don't have money involved in this. Well, sometimes you feel like you owe someone just because they paid you a nice dinner the night before. It doesn't always have to be a financial interest, or it's your cousin or a family member or the son of your nephew So I've created rules about sense of obligation. Do not lobby someone that a reasonable person would think they owe you something. And that's a fun one to interpret. It's not always clear. It's difficult. Ethics is never clear. It's never clear. And it really often is in the eye of the beholder. So it's important that we have these discussions because we all have different opinions about ethics. But the level expectation and the level of standards keep going up. One of my, 10 years ago, I was the General Counsel for Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner in Canada. And we used to have calls all the time about tickets to go see the senators. Nobody wants to see the senators these days, but it used to be that people wanted to go see the hockey players. And can I accept these gifts? And it was just the norm that you would be able to give tickets to concert and shows. Well, that's happening a lot less today. So norms evolve, expectations evolve, and ethical standards evolve, which is why we constantly have to chat about it, talk about it.
Well, thank you, because that at least creates a foundation. And I can't, when I think about you, Caroline, obviously you are operating in a number of different jurisdictions. I assume that you have sort of a top-down policy code that you apply regardless of the market that you're operating in. But these safeguards, does it at least help you be able to see some consistency across the board, start with some foundation as you're talking to your operations in other countries? I mean, given the size of your product portfolio, it must be to some degree helpful. And then follow up to that is, has some of the standards that have come out of the EU, whether it's the reporting standards, et cetera, has that been helpful to help create a standard, or are we muddying the waters again by just having too many avenues of disclosure?
So that's very much my job, which means I'm as you can imagine, a much loved person by all of our teams. But no, I think we were talking about the having very clear prescriptive rules, and that's one of the things we launched our advocacy policy 15 years ago. Advocacy because it goes beyond just lobbying governments, it's how rules of how we engage with a range of stakeholders. But it's next to our code of business conduct and our integrity policy, which have very clear rules. And I think that's the fundamental start of, you need to have these documents clearly. There's a huge amount of internal education and training. I was happy to hear you say that, because actually the vast majority of making sure that this stuff works is really boring. It's, internal training. It's having calls with teams, making sure they understand why it's important, what we mean, et cetera. It's not particularly sexy stuff, and it's not visible stuff either, unless you have exchanges. So we have, as Nancy said, we're subject to the regulatory frameworks in a number of countries, including in France with HATVP, the EU Transparency Register, the US, et cetera, and in a number of other countries. We also have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive coming, it's here now in the European Union. And interestingly, it has a section on lobbying and political engagement. And I think that's going to be very interesting in terms of, again, having a level playing field, not necessarily in terms of what companies do, because it's a reporting mechanism, but in terms of what's public and comparable. Thankfully, because we had been embarked on this journey for quite a long time, it wasn't an adaptation shock to us. It was kind of business as usual in terms of what they're asking. It's pretty much in line with what other standards are asking as well. We're on Danone is working to become a fully certified B Corp at global level by the end of next year. And, that's a voluntary, obviously, mechanism, but what they're asking us is in line with what the EU CSRD is asking us. And it's, I think for us, we really welcome the OECD exercise in developing principles for the private sector on responsible political engagement. We were one of the first businesses involved to make sure that we could support this. I saw Nancy there as well. And the one thing is that it's really important to have a homogeneous framework that can then be implemented across different jurisdictions. I mean, this is kind of usual ask from big businesses, right? We don't want is kind of fragmentation of policy, and then it needs to be enforced. And reason for that is also there needs to be a level playing field. Absolutely does, especially in terms of, transparency, but also in terms of gaining access and the rules of the game.
Yep. And I mean, Lydia, what does this mean to you? This is a lot of information, all available at your fingertips, as much as you can possibly want. Probably, is it the right information? Is it useful at all times? And then, I'll incorporate one of the questions that came into Slido a little bit with the next sort of follow-up with you is that, how do you take this information on and actually make sure you're pushing for policies that are in the best interest of you as an investor, but also best interest of the companies to continue to be profitable while still remaining sort of a ethical good practice?
It's an easy question. so I think there was a lot that's been said, and a couple of things popped into mind as they were talking. One is that regulations and an even playing field are so important. Every company we talk to says that that's exactly what they want. And then when we say, okay, well, maybe you had this controversy, or maybe there's this report, what happened? And then their response is, well, we comply with all necessary rules, regulations, and standards. And you go, I'm glad that you're not directly disobeying the law. We would be having a very different conversation if that's what I thought you were doing. That's the floor. We're not talking about that. That's Nancy's job. That's not my job. So I think it's important to remember that, again, these are really important, but they're the floor for us, at least. We expect much more from our companies from a responsible and ethical perspective, in not just lobbying and political spending, but everything else, quite frankly. And we understand when we talk to companies and they say, well, what is everyone else doing who's a leader in this space? And there are leaders in this space, but we also want you to understand that even if there aren't best practices, you can be a leader in this space. We can give you the gold star for this particular issue, and you could be ahead of the crowd, and nobody wants to do that because it's scary, and what if this happens, and what if that happens? But a lot of times, I think as investors, at least, we're very good at the stick, and I just mean me. I'm good at the stick. I'm not great at the carrot. So it would be better, I think, to lift up some of the companies that do this well, and remember that some people really are out there trying. Not everybody, but some people. And then when we go back to the regulators, or when we talk to the regulators and we say things like, hey, it would be great if you could increase this standard because we've got X, Y, and Z company that have already increased this standard. So maybe it'll be easier. You have to spend less political capital to actually get a regulation changed. I don't have any idea if that answered your question.
I actually think you make a really good point, though, which comes to, is there like a sweet spot of information? And that right.
Sorry, okay.
No, because and that kind of leads back into Nancy too. You could just keep writing regulations on a whim almost that come in and you hear things, but like, what is it, this sort of like feedback loop, and what's the sweet spot of?
I think so in the U.S., there's federal lobbying, but there's also lobbying at each of the 50 states. And each of those 50 states have different regulations and laws governing it. Different people can lobby at different events. Different people can lobby at different percentages. There's different formats of reporting. So when you talk to companies that do work in the U.S. and lobby at the state level, they'll say, well, but that's all in the public domain. And you go, is it? It kind of is, but it would be a full-time job to try to pull all of those reports. And I know you already know it. So why don't you just put it on your website in a place we can all see it? And that's kind of a really easy low-hanging fruit ask to say, look, we know that technically you've already done it, but it's nearly impossible for a layperson to find. People have done studies on this. It's really, really hard. So while there is, in certain parts of this work, a lot of information, it can be really hard to find and really hard to understand. So it helps a lot if companies will sort of put it in a way that makes it easy. Just post it on your website. You don't. It can be an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be fancy. But help us help you so that we can understand. If you're doing everything right, help us understand that, and just put it out there and let us see it. And I think some companies do that really well, and some don't, just like everything else. And then there are some companies that I think really enjoy the idea of how complicated some of this is, because they kind of want to pat you on your head and say, this is too much, you won't understand it. When in reality, there's a lot of IRS tax codes for who can do what. But at the end of the day, if you're spending money to influence policy, you should disclose it. You don't have to be any kind of expert in US or French or Canadian tax law or any other kind of laws to understand that. And I think where you can get really in the weeds in this issue, it should not prevent anyone from engaging on it.
And how do you reflect on that, Caroline? I mean, from your perspective, is there like, do you respond to that? Do you try to? I'm going to assume you're one of the better practice players since you've been selected for this panel.
So.
Or,
she gets the gold star.
Lydia was referring to you, or would be. I mean, you must have to organize your information in a way. I'm assuming you listen to your stakeholders and your shareholders, and you make those available. Is there anything else that helps you sort of get down to the crux of what's important, even though you have the whole backlog of files available?
It's first of all, I think it's definitely is a journey for a company in terms of for mindset going from internal information to external. I was interested by something you said about the stick and the carrot. I think there needs to be, indeed, as you said, more kind of applause for those companies who are transparent. I remember one of our first calls we had with an investor on these topics, and they, took about 10 minutes in our call to tell us about a peer of ours who had done a self-assessment, voluntary, published on their website.
We knew that was going to happen.
I called it.
That was going to happen.
And that they hadn't scored very well. And I thought, this is not the good message. Like, this is not how you get more people on board. No, I do think it's a journey in terms of information, in terms of, you see a lot of the usual faces in terms of companies who are involved in these topics from different sectors. And I think one of the things is that it is quite daunting when you come into this topic for the first time. There's a lot of indexes out there. There's a lot of benchmarks. Sometimes they're asking the same thing, so then you're good to go. But sometimes you don't really understand what's behind it, and you're not quite sure. And also, I think a box-ticking approach doesn't make a company strategy or roadmap on your responsible political engagement, et cetera. So I think for us, what we found very helpful is just honestly just leaning into the exchanges, just including with investors, but also with NGOs, with other groups, and using them to, shamelessly get information. It's a great education resource opportunity, but also to explain to them, well, you're asking us this. We don't think that's a good use of our time, and we don't think this is, material for us. And I think, this is going to sound like a double-edged sword, but I think part of the approach is also to put the onus on these companies to report what they think is material. Because yes, you can have databases of meetings with government officials, et cetera, but the dream would be to say, here's the topic, here's my policy, here's my position. Here are the policies we're supporting, and here who we're working with, whether it's NGOs or trade associations, et cetera. And I think part of that is, we have, double materiality becoming massively commonplace for businesses now, at least, big multinationals to do. We know what our sensitive topics are, and we know where we should be. So I think that's, for me, it's also that tension between reporting and just kind of drowning in data versus, okay, we know what matters. We know what we're interested in. Where you have an impact. What your biggest markets are. Where, your biggest operations are. So I think that's where, and I don't think businesses are quite there yet. It's a mix of different approaches.
I want to follow up with that, but I want to bring, Nancy in, because do you feel like it's your responsibility to just have sort of baseline regulations on every single thing that you see coming in, or is this meaningfulness information? Does it bring, is there ever policies that you actually sort of phase out when you went in to sort of redo all of your policies and your registry? Do you think about, that's not really relevant anymore? Is there a way to sort of consolidate to make things easier?
So as a regulator, all of the obligations to disclose certain information for lobbyists at the federal level is set in statute. And I wish I had power to amend the statute. I don't. So there are specific mandatory obligations of disclosure on the registry of lobbyists at the federal level. Is it all useful? Maybe not. Could there be more? Yes. And to me, disclosure on your website needs to be accessible, searchable, meaningful, relevant, timely, and with enough details that are meaningful to the citizens. So to publish your financial statements of 5 years ago is, you need to be timely. I always, at the registry level for us, it's a bit of a joke, to say as an environmental group that you discussed with the Minister of Environment about the environment is completely useless to citizens. So you need enough details. What program, what policy, what's the outcome that you want out of and that's how citizens can meaningfully participate in understanding what the corporations and the groups and the associations, and whether a corporation, an organization, a non-for-profit, what do they want from our decision makers? And to just say environment, it's not meaningful. So there needs to be enough detail and timeliness. Like, it can't be in 6 months. And so there needs to be very quick turnaround time to disclose the information that is important and relevant to the constituents who are watching, and again, the purpose of all this is always to ensure that the decision makers, because this is the topic, engaging with the public side of things, are making decisions that are based on real information and in what they would consider public interest. We can all disagree whether it's in the public interest or not, but you need the information, and citizens need to know what's being discussed and about what and to whom about what and when.
And I think that point is really interesting from an investor perspective, right? Because you're engaging with companies trying to affect change. They have what's in their best interest, so they may be lobbying with policymakers. But how do you consider your sort of positions and the actual dialogues you're having, Lydia, on policy? And how do you know, again, that you're advocating for the right policy, and this idea of unintended consequences, how does, maybe you can give us an example of how one of those engagements or dialogues have played out, and if you might share if there was one that maybe didn't go the right way because you didn't quite have the right angle, or maybe the market didn't go the right way.
Yeah.
Or,
Sure. I got you. Got a lot of
doesn't
examples
just have
of
to
that
be on
one.
you.
So I think it's a really interesting question, because we've talked a lot about disclosure, and it's the bedrock of any good policy. But there. And I think maybe I'm ruining this question for later, but there was a question around, does good disclosure lead to better political spending outcomes? And my answer to that question is basically, everyone with more responsible political spending has good disclosure, but not everyone with good disclosure has good political spending. So all thumbs are fingers, not all fingers are thumbs type of situation, right? And excuse me. So when we're talking about what a company, what's good policy for a company and what's good policy for an investor, going beyond disclosure is talking about alignment. And there's a lot of this at the climate level, and this is the only time I'm going to talk about climate. I'll talk about that enough. But I think they had a really interesting idea when they started talking about, all right, we understand that you've disclosed a lot of your political spending, but is it actually aligning with your stated mission, goals, and values as a company? I work a lot in the pharmaceutical sector, and every pharmaceutical company in the world will tell you they put patients first. We care about patients and access to medicines, and it's the only thing we care about. Now, when you look at the policies for which they advocate, or the trade associations that they belong to advocate for, you often get a very different message. So how have we got a little column A and a little column B and mesh it together? And that's actually most of the conversations I have these days with companies. There are some laggards in disclosure, but mostly these days it's saying, okay, we're glad that you disclosed this, but now how are you actually aligning your publicly stated mission as a company with who you're giving money to? Because that's a severe reputational risk. We can talk about the craziness that's happened in the States in the last several years around, attempted coup at the Capitol, and are you giving money to these people? What does all this look like from a corporate perspective, and how is it aligning to who you actually want to be as a company? And these aren't easy questions to answer. It can be very nebulous, but it's an important discussion to have. And then sometimes at least, I find that I'll be talking to a company and they'll say, well, we lobbied against this particular piece of legislation because we believe it'll harm patients. Now, everyone else in the entire world has said this will help patients. So there's again, that disconnect there where it's like, I understand the words you're telling me, but every academic, every regulator, every NGO is telling me the exact opposite. How am I supposed to reconcile this as an investor? Because I want you to be profitable and make money. That's good. But I also want people to be able to access your medicines. So how do we sort of walk that line? And it's not an easy question to answer, but it all starts with disclosure that can then lead into that discussion and move forward from there. Theoretically, we haven't gotten to move forward from there yet, but one day.
Well, I'm gonna jump sort of ahead a little bit because you did mention trade associations. And so if you have a company, for example, that's saying one thing, or maybe I will suggest this, maybe hiding behind a trade association, how do you engage with the trade associations? How has that been going? Is it a meaningful discussion?
It's a triggering question for me. We've recently I'm working with a coalition of investors in the defense tech space, and we've been trying to engage a trade association and been pretty stonewalled. And that's been my general experience with trade associations. Companies will talk to you even if they don't, most companies will talk to you even if they don't want to, because they kind of feel like they have to. Trade associations don't feel like they have to date. And we were discussing this earlier, and hopefully that's going to change. But because we are not obviously directly invested in said trade association, I think they think it's just much easier to stonewall us entirely. And we'll go to the individual members of said association and say, hey, can you get us a meeting? And they'll say, we'll try really, really hard. And maybe they did it, maybe they didn't. I don't know. But that's kind of, unless we're going to go public about something, pretty much the end of our influence there. So as much as we would love to talk to trade associations, and I think not just from a political giving perspective, I think when you can talk to a trade association, they're an association of the industry you want to talk to. You can a lot of birds with one stone in that discussion, but unfortunately, it just doesn't really happen.
Caroline, on to you on trade associations. I mean, how many trade associations you have? Are you guys members of? Is it hundreds or is it?
Yeah, definitely. We're in over 80 markets around the world. We have 4 business categories. So you're looking at, just finished the mapping. We're looking at close to 400, which is kind of the norm for big multinational companies. And so for me, there's 2 points on alignment. And the first one is internal, going back to what Lydia was saying. I think there's a huge amount of work to do internally. And I was really happy because the OECD has actually given a lot of space to that and a lot of advice on that. Beyond just disclosure, to make sure things are going in the right way, because it needs to be a strategy, right? Like it needs to be like a deliberate sense of direction. And when you're looking at a big company with public affairs people on the ground in different geographies, you really, really need to run a tight ship. And for us, that started with, some very, very basic things, but I think a lot of companies need to put into place as well is, do we have an internal library where all of our policies and positions on key topics are clearly stated? Do we make sure that that is the framework in which all of our teams have to operate, i.e. they can adapt, they can implement to their local realities, but that is the frame. So when we say we support legislation on X, you better support legislation on X. And then behind that is a huge amount of, training of teams. The misalignment discussion in trade associations, which I promise I'll come to in a second, it's a relatively new debate, but it's still a very global level debate. And it's, we were very fixed on the US, for example, in the EU or France, where I'm based. But these sorts of issues and blockages to more progressive legislation or positions from trade associations, they happen in every country around the world. So one of the things we've been working on is just having one framework that's then cascaded down. And I think that's more work, actually, than this is going back to basically making sure that what you're doing, it makes sense and that your end objective, and then you're not just box ticking, okay, we're going to be good in the US because everyone looks at US lobbying, when actually you can have, the same reasons of why you need to have a strong framework and governance is perhaps even more true for countries where you have less strong institutions and less oversight. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't answer your question, but
no. But I mean, trade associations are necessary in certain countries where there's a disparate amount of organizations that need a collective voice. Yeah. But by contrast, I guess everybody in this room would say there's a real concern that trade associations are holding us back on a number of different issues, particularly with certain sectors. Yes. And, so I guess some of it, you are almost at the coalface of joining trade associations. As you review some of those, do you decide some are not acting in your best interest, so you decide to take them off your list? And is investor, opinion on that, does that come into play at all when you decide who's on your join and not join list?
Yeah. So I think for on the trade association, there's been lots of discussions, which is great in recent years. The first thing is that disagreement is the norm in a trade association. Okay. It is like, I think that's one of the things that there's sometimes a bit of a, debate about. It's not a lot of businesses who go in and have the same opinion and decide to have happily agree to have an advocacy or a lobbying program. Disagreement is the norm. And then that leads to the common denominator effect. The second thing is that misalignment is bad for business, right? When you're paying your membership fees, and they can be quite high in certain markets, and then the trade association is lobbying against that, that does not make sense from a business point of view. And for me, there's two things. There's the deliberate misalignment where you've had some businesses very publicly called out because they've purposefully, said the right thing in public, and then they go and get their trade association to do exactly the opposite. Right. And that needs to be called out. The more complex topic I find is indeed, how do you get a trade association, whether it's an organization in its own right or whether it's a sum of, all of its actors' opinions, to lean into more progressive, views. I don't think we know how to do that in terms of a magic bullet yet. I think there's a lot of groups that are working on it, whether it's WBCSD, B Team, OECD, the Good Lobby. There's a lot of groups that are bringing together companies, NGOs, investors, UNPRI as well, to discuss this. There are some best practice. So doing your review of trade associations, we do a massive review. We do an external review as part of our CDP on climate to make sure that we're aligned in terms of the Paris Agreement. Internally, we do lots of reviews in terms of the governance, the strategy, what are their positions, what are ours. When we have misalignment, there's a couple of things that you can do. You can get it written down in the minutes. You can send a formal letter. You can do your own submission to public consultations, which is very effective. Or you can have, and we got a lot of questions from investors at one point saying, are you committed to saying you're going to leave within 6 months if there's misalignment? And we've not committed to that because I wish it were that easy, but I don't think that that's the magic. We have left trade associations in the past because when we've been completely misaligned on a topic, but you're just going to misplace and you risk removing one of the more progressive elements from the conversation. And interestingly, this morning, Glenn Horowitz from Mighty Earth was saying, you also, beyond trade associations, the coalitions of the willing are fundamentally important. And I think that's what we've seen as well, is just taking companies from other sectors, from our own sector, who want to go further, taking NGOs, and it's what we did on methane, to make sure that we could drive influence.
Nancy, do you have a...
Well,
on the
I
record,
don't
off
have
the
all
record,
this insight. for
on the record,
sure.
off the record view of how the
well, I
what
have
trade-
lots of views, but I
Trade
can't-
associations, or
I don't
maybe-
have the insight that they do with respect to trade
Yeah.
associations. But from the regulator's perspective, trade associations that have employees that actually have paid people or who hire people to lobby on their behalf are registered. So there is some transparency at the federal level about the work of trade associations if they're not all just coming together and are volunteers. I always that's my pet peeve, the volunteer. Well, there's a concept in the lobbying regime requires people to be paid. So you're either an employee or a consultant lobbyist. So there has to be a payment of some sort. And some people will say, oh, I'm only communicating with our decision makers, but I don't get paid. So therefore I'm a volunteer, therefore I'm not a lobbyist. To me, but for your employment, you wouldn't be on this association. But for your employment, you wouldn't be volunteer. And you don't volunteer at 7 o'clock at night. You're volunteering during your work hours with your computer. You are, to me, should be registering because it's about transparency. And so there is some transparency about the work that associations are doing. That's really all I can contribute to this.
And is there a differentiation with sort of business roundtables or chambers of commerce? I don't know the answer to this. I'm not that familiar with the nuances here, but should we be considering them different?
Chambers of commerce are registered at the federal level for they're a group. They're getting paid. They meet there's a threshold for in-house. Like if you don't talk about consultant, but if you talk about in-house organizations and corporations, there's a threshold at the federal level that needs to go, but it's there. And if it's a significant part of your duties to lobby or to communicate, you need to register. So chambers are registered at the federal level.
Can I make one quick point about chambers of commerce? I think they're special in terms of the common denominator effect because you have all these sectors represented.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we found in our engagement with investors, and this is also because there's more of a data-driven approach to looking at what companies are doing, and so sometimes we get very random examples that are pulled by NGOs and published online, and they'll say to us, you're part of this chamber of commerce in this country, and this chamber of commerce does not have a progressive view on climate, and we want you to act. And unfortunately, it is a country where we are, very small. We'll have some person who goes to a technical working group to get information. There's no advocacy. We don't do any lobbying there. We're like, and we have to have these conversations saying, well, we're not the right guys. Like, this is not a good use of our time. We know where our battles are. We know where we need to drive change, and where we can focus. But I think chambers of commerce are particularly difficult because they have this really cross-sector, and then you're just going to go down to the kind of lowest common denominator kind of aspect.
Have you had some conversations with chambers, Lydia?
Nope.
Do you steer clear? They seem in the
I'd
U.S.
love
to be very. They seem to be very vocal in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is, sort of this behemoth in this particular world. And no, we honestly, I'm not even sure we've tried. I can't lie. I'm not sure it would be the best use of our time.
Right.
I think to the earlier point, they do tend to cater to the lowest common denominator, and the companies that are in it are just so unlikely to get out of it.
Yeah. Maybe we should just touch on the U.S. I mean, I have been considering it's a nice special case in some ways. I mean, I've just recently moved special from being in the EU and the UK for a number of years, and then back to the US and kind of getting up to speed and being kind of at the cold face of what's happening there. And for me, I think it's a bit of a standout. So companies in the US can make direct or indirect political contributions through political action committees, right? They're established by a corporation and tell me if I have this definition wrong. My understanding is they could be established by a corporation or a trade association, and they can facilitate getting their opinions heard, right, with political candidates and to support their political interests. They have, they're regulated to some extent. I'm sure we'll get onto how Canada regulates those. But, there's a maximum amount that can be given through these political action committees. Now, the U.S., from what I understand, has a nice special caveat by having super PACs, where companies can make indirect contributions, right? So to support issues in indirect ways. So whether they are spending on comms or media or education or however you want to sort of umbrella that, and that there's no limit to that. They can't supposedly give money directly to candidates, but they can operate all around the outside. And, there's been millions of dollars that have funneled to these super PACs. So there's a lot going on behind closed doors or inside of murky waters. And, sort of ironically, as we're talking about this panel about transparency, I assume none of us here are engaging on sort of the latter super PAC area. But, we have seen, back to a lot of shareholder proposals, a lot of investors coming in at really wanting to understand the alignment of political donations, either through trade bodies or directly, and companies' commitments through sustainability. And I think, from my understanding, that's where I've seen mostly investors engaging, really trying to hold companies accountable for what they're saying and then what they're funding through the back door. And a lot of that has looked like it's been sort of reducing the impact that a lot of our discussions, where we put a lot of time and effort in on trying to make more progressive inroads into environmental and social issues. So I'm sure most of you have heard them, but like a company will be making very sort of public commitments around reducing emissions or around their climate policy, and then on the other side actually funding politicians who are working on legislation that's opposing sort of more climate progressive policies, or something to do with like banning reproductive rights. So Nancy, let's kick off with you. Is that sort of does Canada, does it operate in the same way? Can it operate in the same way? How can people have more influence in sort of?
So first, I'm not the electoral commissioner. I'm not the electoral expert. However, when I first started about an hour ago and I said it has to be an integrated vision, and if we want healthy democracies, the rules all have to align to have the same sort of vision. In Canada, the maximum an individual can give to a campaign is $1,750. That's it. Corporations can't donate.
Yay.
Corporations can't donate, and they can only donate up to, I think it's around, again, don't quote me on that, but it's around $600,000 for advertising. And that's public. You go on the elections website and you'll see which corporation gave for what for advertising. That's it. So when in Canada people tell me, oh gosh, I don't want to be called a lobbyist. I'm not a lobbyist. I don't lobby. But you communicate with officials. You are a lobbyist. Sorry, that's the words that we use. You can call yourself whatever. But people roll their eyes all the time because they associate in Canada. People don't know that it's not like in the US where millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars can be given to support a campaign. And then, of course, when I was talking a few minutes ago about a sense of obligation, if you get support of millions of dollars from a corporation, you're going to feel like you got to help them out when you get elected, if you get elected. That doesn't really exist that much to that extent in Canada because the values are so low. So we don't hear it or see it as much. And very often Canadians need to be reminded of that. It's not the same game, but we see what's in the news, obviously, and so people react, or we see it on TV. We see the TV shows, and people, oh my gosh, in Canada, no, but the rules are not the same to start with, and so it changes the game completely in Canada. And again, I'm not the expert, but I've been around this area long enough to know that it has to be, I can have the best rules in the world about a $40 hospitality. If you can give millions in a political, contribution, and my little $40 is who cares? It has to be, everybody needs to align together to be able to support, again, and I repeat myself, like confidence and healthy democracies.
Seems obvious.
One
One would say.
yeah.
Yeah. So, Caroline, I assume you guys aren't playing in this
you're not.
pond.
I'm not going to be very interesting. I'm afraid on this one. Danone does not make political contributions. We don't make financial. We don't make in kind. We don't make direct. We don't make indirect. It's now important to specify all of these kind of clauses because it's actually funny because we've always had this kind of we had this position for a long time, and then the paragraph every year I keep adding to it because the more there's mechanisms to kind of not give but give somehow. I need to specify that we don't do that either. So we don't solicit, we don't fundraise, et cetera. And obviously our employees can as private individuals, which is normal, but we don't. And I think obviously political contributions, companies probably make them because there's a return on investment, right? Otherwise, why people are going to spend so much money? So I think, in our case, we've chosen to hold ourselves up to a higher standard. And I think it can have impact on relationship or, relationship building or access. But it's, in my job at least, makes it much more easy to be able to know and to avoid, issues. And also, not my job to say what kind of reform needs to happen in which country or not, but back to the level playing field and transparency point. I think that's fundamental, that that you're all playing the same rules of the game, and that, you have access because you have expertise, because you can, you want to share a point of view, you might disagree, but you don't pay for access.
That's it. Well, can I add before? Okay. In the lobbyist code of conduct, anyone here registered on the registry? You can admit to it. I won't investigate you. Okay.
Is that a promise?
No, I'll go and meet with them after. If you're on the registry, you're subject to the code of conduct. In my code of conduct, there is that sense of obligation rule, and one of the rules is very much you cannot lobby someone for whom you've done political, i.e., partisan, not the political we're talking about, but partisan work. So if you were the person that knocked door to door with a candidate, then if that person gets elected, you can't go start lobbying them. So I've made a rule specific about partisan participation. You can do it. I'm not stopping you from doing it. But as a regular of lobbying, if you choose to lobby after, there will be a cooling off period, depending on what you did. If you stuffed envelope or delivered pizza, you may not have to, but it really, depending on your role, you may have a cooling off period from then participating or being able to lobby that individual that you helped get elected. I'm pretty strict. No, the standards are pretty high. That was in the news for a while. I never made the Globe and Mail until that one came out. But anyway.
Well, that's good to hear. So, Lydia, when you think about, and it's been going on for quite some time, do you think we made progress on this conversation with companies of, lobbying for certain, I guess, climate legislation or pharma legislation, and actually their public commitments? And is that, do you think, the best area for investors to be engaging when it comes to political lobbying? Like, is it at the mismatch of what they're saying and what they're doing behind the scenes? Or is there a better way for us to sort of move policy ahead through dialogue?
Just enjoying my American chair of shame over here. Just for those of you that don't know, you can, as Maria kind of mentioned, corporations here can give as much money as they want. There are no real restrictions. You can find a way. If you want to give somebody $10 billion, you can, and people have. There's the Supreme Court decided corporations are people, so now there's no real rules, which means that there's a lot of misalignment of stated policy goals and actual political giving. I think, and I'll back up a little bit because I said earlier that we talk now a lot about alignment, and we do, but there are still places where disclosure is lacking. And in the US, there's, not just social welfare groups like 501c3s and 501c4s, but there's also 527s and the numbers don't matter, but they're governors associations, the Republican Governors Association, the Democratic Governors Association, the Republican Attorneys General, the Democratic Attorneys General, and these people have enormous influence at the state level policy. And in the US, state level policy drives the ship. So these companies are giving a lot of money, as the CPA-Zicklin Index, which if you don't know it, you should look it up, the Center for Political Accountability, did a recent report on this. They're giving a lot of money to governors associations and state attorneys general in order to influence policy. But that all sort of had to be sussed out by an NGO. And I don't know that any company, well, there are a few that are reporting on this, but very few. So there are always increased disclosures. And I actually love this when I get a company to actually do something on this and I'll go back. They'll say, but we did what you asked. I said, well, now I'm asking for something else, because that's just how it works. Like, if you're not moving, you're not improving. And so don't come back to me and say, we did what you did last year, I don't want to see you again. I'm saying, well, that's unfortunate because you're going to see me again. There's always more you can disclose on wealth to a certain extent. And then we can talk about the alignment piece. And I mean, Maria, I think it's a really valid question to ask if this is the best space for investors. I can't say if it's the best space for investors, but it's a necessary space for investors. We have to be a part of this conversation. Or the conversation is just going to be carried by all of the other stakeholders who are probably in favor of just unlimited capital being thrown at political parties and policy regulators. So I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Well, I still have some questions here on Slido, but in order to make it a little bit more dynamic, and I've tried to weave some of them in as we've been going, but would anyone like to actually ask a question in person? If I haven't gotten to your question on Slido, it might make it a little bit more interactive if you kind of speak up and ask your question. If not, I can just ask it. Come on, make it a little bit more exciting. Okay, over here?
Yeah.
So on that last point, which I think was extremely, extremely valid, and as you said, important for this community, who do you think is best placed to counter that lobbying effort, right? So, is it individual investor investment management groups? Is it asset owners? Is it groups like the PRI? Because it just, when going up against almost such a sophisticated machinery, how best to be impactful?
At the big U.S. level, to counter
Yes,
some
absolutely.
of these big voices.
It's for you.
Well, my answer to who should
Get Nancy to write your regulation. Hire Nancy.
Yeah, there we go.
And let's clone her.
So I think you named a bunch of groups, and my answer to all of them is yes. Because there is at least loose coordination in the U.S. around PACs and super PACs, even though there technically isn't supposed to be. There has to be coordination at this level as well, between whether it's the PRI, Climate Action 100. There's a bunch of different groups out there that can discuss about the best ways to move forward on this issue. But I think, and this is something that I know some investors are reticent to do, but it has to be loud and public. I think you say, look, this is our money that you're now reinvesting in these political expenditures that may or may not be benefiting the company. Like we don't really know. So we need to know more about what you're actually doing, and we need to know whether or not it is actually aligned with the values of the company in which we invest. So I think you can also talk to the Vanguards and BlackRocks of the world, the real big ones, and say, what are your policies on this? Why are your policies so bad? Might be a better question to ask them. Along with, proxy advisors, we all know there's a whole micro environment and macro environment on this issue. And if you want movement, because there is literally unlimited money in the US being spent on this, that effort has to be matched. otherwise, and not necessarily from a money perspective, but from an effort perspective. And who's best to lead that charge, I'm not going to answer because I frankly don't know. But it does have to be everyone. It can't just be one, because it'll get drowned out.
Thank you.
But that's on a very macro level. Don't lose hope. On an individual level, I do still think it's really, really important to engage the companies, because there are, like on the CPA Zicklin Index, AT&T has a 100% score. Hewlett-Packard has a good score. Visa has a good score. There are companies out there that are disclosing this information really well. And then you can sort of continue to have these conversations and move them forward. But at a macro 30,000 foot view, it's bleak. I'm not going to lie.
If I can, just on the, not so much the political contribution thing, but I think there is a point also in that on the company side, companies across sectors are increasingly coming together, the ones who are trying to do the right thing. I emphasize that because I think it's a kind of ever increasing journey. And I think there's increasingly going to be loosely coordinated efforts across sectors, people saying, okay, well, actually there's, enough of us who think this is not acceptable, or who think that, this merits to looking at again. And one of the examples we've spoken of that is happening at the moment, trade associations kind of refusing to engage. And the companies are getting a lot of the pressure. And I gave you the example of the Chamber of Commerce actually now we've come to, thanks to collaboration and open exchanges, we've come to a moment where NGOs, investors, and companies, there's several projects and work streams to just really tackle trade associations straight on. And that's kind of, everyone's supportive of that. We'll see if trade associations are supportive. Some of them should be. Someone was saying in the last session that you have trade associations, you have alternatives in certain sectors on different topics, et cetera. Right. And so I think you can through kind of constructive exchange and collaboration, you could have to find allies.
Yep. Can I ask a question? I have a question. So, Carolina, you don't spend any money in the U.S. On the political candidates. Do you find that negates your influence in the U.S.?
So I don't do lobbying in the U.S. directly. Sure. So I think no. I mean I like to think that we have influence in the U.S. We do. If you look at our influence map record, you'll see that we've supported kind of policies, etc. I think it's, as I said before. I think political contributions. We wouldn't know until we, maybe if we started political contributions, maybe we there'd be a whole world opening to us. I think it's not, not to be naive. Like, people make political contributions of those sizes. You've got to be seeing a good return on investment somewhere, right? You're just, I don't think so. No, it's definitely, and I think this is part of the thing about the beginning saying, well, it's a higher standard, and we know it's a higher standard, and higher standards have costs, and hence the need for, if not a level playing field across on every topic, transparency in terms of who gets what for what. But no, we're very much conscious, and it's not just the U.S. We were talking informally about this with someone the other day. There's a lot of different countries where there's this, as Nancy was saying, these muddy waters of we're not actually giving a political contribution. We're just helping out an event for a friend's wife, etc. And so that's why also why is a multinational company based with headquarters in Europe, but in over 80 markets, it's easier to just say none, and then enforce it internally.
A question here on Slido, quite directly. Just, can asset owners directly lobby governments in Canada?
Can what, sorry?
Asset owners.
Asset owners.
Yeah, so pension funds, can they
directly? If they're a corporation or an organization, yes. Yeah. Can they lobby? Yes. Should they be registered? Yes. The problem is that, again, if they're a corporation or an organization, depending if they've got, obviously they have investment, so they'd be probably a corporation. Because if they hire a consultant, it's automatically a registration. But if they are a corporation, they need to meet a threshold, which is the total of everybody that lobbies amounts to 20% of one person's time, which has been calculated about 30 hours a month, which is too big. So I'm working on that. And but the threshold is too high, which has been one of the recommendations to amend. Should be registration by default with very specific exemptions, which is what British Columbia is doing now, where in BC you have to register unless your organization is very, very small, like X number of people and X number of hours, but otherwise you're in. So yes, there's no reason to exclude them. Yeah.
So I'll just have one follow-up question, and I'll take another from the audience, but just sort of on the theme of asset owners. What should asset owners be asking their external managers to identify? How do we identify those with leading practices in assessing political lobbying of their portfolio companies? What do you have clients asking you about, or what do you think they should? Is there, obviously asset owners could really help drive this. They can help drive it by speaking to their policymakers on some of these high-level issues. How can they engage with their external managers to make sure that their voice is heard if that's how they're having most of their assets managed?
I don't do that.
I don't know.
So I mean, I'm the wrong person to ask. I think, there has to be harmony in the two groups, but at the end of the day, I generally do the research on my own or use research that's already been done when I'm looking at a company. Like I don't have to go back and ask them because I already know. And then we don't, probably, I don't know of very many people that have like exclusions around this issue. No. So it's more just, how are you going to engage the company?
I guess, is there other organizations? You mentioned Influence Map, but is that something that you would recommend? I mean, maybe for the asset owners, but maybe to see as a focal point with asset managers, or by what means are you sort of assessing the lobbying within the companies that you are your investee companies?
Yeah, the things that are, first off, the things that they report, right? So the disclosures that they have, but then also Access Medicine Index, Access Nutrition Index, Influence Map, CPA, Zicklin Index. There's a few out there. I'm not a climate person, so I'm sure there's a lot of climate stuff y'all know, but
no, and the climate example is interesting because I think it's where there's things are probably most mature in terms of conversations. So it's interesting for climate, it's great, but it's also setting a precedence for other topics. And one of the things that we've been making sure, and it's not that obvious, I don't think we've got it all right yet, is making sure that whatever we're putting in place is going to work for other issues. We're talking about climate has the benefit, apart from being a very complex and huge challenge, it's got the benefit of having the Paris Agreement, of having 1.5, of having science-based, and then you have issues of health and nutrition where it gets more complicated, and you're going to get more, and hence the importance of having open policy positions, et cetera. But on climate, what we found as a company, our engagement with Influence Map, our engagement with, CA 100+, our engagement with, specific investors, it's been very, very positive because there's been that alignment. And it's not to say we do agree on everything, but we have very open exchanges. So we'll have exchanges with Influence Map, and this is what I was saying about going beyond the data, because you can't just have a box ticking approach. You also, need to have an exchange and see also what the next topics are, and also explain why we, for example, why we don't commit to leaving after 6 months of a trade association. Might change my mind, but not sure yet.
Right. I just wanted to take a final question. I think there was
a
one
gentleman right here too. He's had his hand up.
So okay, fine.
Well, but you can take another.
No, well, I don't know if there was somebody else, but maybe just taking it in a little bit related to climate, but related to basically to everything. So in order to get to net zero, we need to electrify the electricity grid. Otherwise, there's no way we can get there. So that's not something that individual utility companies can solve, but it's not something that maybe it's a regulator, or is it a politician, or is it a trade association? It's maybe to try and get a little bit of an idea, like where is it that both asset managers and asset owners should, in your view, should try and focus on in order to get to a green electricity net or grid. Where do you think the best in your opinion? Where's the best use of energy?
No pun
Maybe
intended.
bad pun. Is that to go for the politicians to get the whole rules and the whole, like, get an IRA as in the US? Is it to get the regulator to set stricter regulation on companies or target for what they have to do of renewable energy? Or is it to trade associations and say, okay, we better go in this way? So in terms of how you leverage the impact that both investors and companies can have, where is the biggest impact?
Well, I don't think we have a climate specialist panel, but I mean, if you guys have a view on that, go ahead. But I'll caveat, not everyone here focuses solely on climate.
Yeah, I don't know anything about climate, but I think the question is, when you're talking about this in the context in which we're discussing it, which is around money and politics, how is your time best spent when you're trying to impact said policy? And I, as asset owners or asset managers, so companies, talking to the companies and the trade associations, if you can, just because that's where you have money, that's where you have leverage. And then going back to make it public, put it in the public sphere so regulators can have some backup when they need to change whatever regulation it is you're talking about.
And I think just from the corporate side, this is a question, for me, it's almost like a strategy question. It's like, how am I gonna, and what we've seen, where we haven't spoken a lot about that, but the topics that you pick obviously ours are part of our sustainability strategy, part of our business strategy. They're quite listed openly, which I think is fundamental. But it can be direct lobbying. It can be through trade associations, and what we've seen emerging more and more is also the importance of, alignment with other stakeholders. It can be unions, it can be NGOs, etc. And that's absolutely, I think, fundamental, especially if you're trying to do something different. You need to go find people in other sectors, people who are thinking differently and who might want to move things forward. It's what we've done when weren't able to get necessarily the buy-in from our usual colleagues on topics, and it's worked well. And I think in kind of mixing these different views and seeking out different collaborations.
Oh, I'm not touching that one.
No, but I think that's an interesting point to land on, right? Because I don't think there's going to be a silver bullet in anything, unfortunately. And it probably means that we continue for quite some time to have similar conversations over and over again until we have the mechanism to move on just a little bit. And we've seen that happen with the Inflation Reduction Act not here in the US, we're in Canada, but we almost need one of those little catalysts to kind of move the conversation on. But I do think that, we have partners in not only at the federal level, but I think at the corporate level, where we need to really focus the light on those leaders and, give them a bit of an opportunity to push the needle and not, beat them down when they're extending a little bit beyond what we would normally think that they do, to kind of create a leadership position to bring their peers on. And, we have to continue as investors, right? We've seen the fruits of our labor as we've continued to keep our foot on the gas pedal and trying to push for more transparency and disclosure. And again, we want to go beyond just this base level, lowest common denominator, minimal framework. So I think we have to make sure that we keep our voice heard, right? And make it the most transparent market for us to operate in. So I ask you all to thank my panelists for a wonderful discussion. And thank you for the questions from the audience.
Thank you.